The veterinarian's hands trembled as she stepped back from the massive lion standing guard over the wooden coffin, her stethoscope clattering to the funeral home floor. 500 mourners had come to pay their respects to James Patterson, but none of them could get near his body. Caesar wasn't supposed to be here. The 600-pound African lion had somehow broken free from his enclosure 20 miles away, traveled through the Kenyan wilderness, and positioned himself as a living barrier between the old conservationist's casket and anyone who dared approach. A woman in the front row began sobbing uncontrollably, recognizing the impossible devotion in the great cat's amber eyes. Children pressed against windows, cell phones recording as the lion gently placed his massive paw on the coffin's edge, his deep rumble echoing through the stunned silence like a prayer. "Nobody move," whispered the funeral director, his voice cracking with disbelief. "Call the authorities." Now. But how do you explain a wild animal's grief? And what would happen when they tried to take Caesar away from the only father he'd ever known? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. The morning sun cast long shadows across Sunset Ridge Ranch, where James "Jimmy" Patterson had lived alone for 40 years. At 68, the former Marine still rose at dawn, his weathered hands steady as he prepared coffee in the same chipped mug he'd carried through 3 wars. The Purple Heart on his mantelpiece caught the early light, a reminder of battles fought and friends lost in places most Americans had forgotten. Jimmy stepped onto his porch, breathing in the familiar scent of acacia trees and red earth. 20 miles from the nearest town in Kenya's Masai Mara, his 5,000-acre ranch was sanctuary to dozens of rescued animals. But none meant more to him than Caesar, the massive lion who emerged from the morning mist like a golden ghost, padding silently across the yard with the grace of true royalty. "Morning, son," Jimmy murmured, his voice carrying the distinctive drawl of rural Tennessee. The lion approached without fear, nuzzling the old man's outstretched hand with surprising gentleness. For 20 years this ritual had marked the beginning of each day, a bond forged in blood and trust that defied every natural law. 50 miles away in Nairobi, Dr. Margaret "Maggie" Sullivan packed her veterinary bag with the methodical precision of someone running from ghosts. At 58, the divorced Boston native had traded a comfortable practice for the dust and danger of African wildlife conservation. She told colleagues she came for the challenge, but the truth lived deeper. In the hollow spaces where a family should have been, in the daughter she'd given up 30 years ago, in the father whose name she'd never known. Maggie's phone buzzed with another message from Victoria Blackwood, the wealthy American developer who'd been circling Jimmy's property like a vulture. Victoria's text was brief but insistent. "The old man can't hold out forever. This deal benefits everyone." Maggie deleted it without responding, unaware that Victoria's interest in Sunset Ridge ran deeper than mere business, rooted in a rejection from 40 years past and a heart that had calcified into something resembling stone. In her luxury suite at the Nairobi Serena Hotel, Victoria stared at geological surveys spread across mahogany tables. The reports confirmed what she'd suspected for decades. Jimmy Patterson's worthless ranch sat atop one of East Africa's largest oil reserves, worth nearly $500 million. Her son Thomas watched from the doorway, his environmental science degree making him an unwilling witness to his mother's obsession. "He saved my life once," Thomas said quietly, remembering the day Caesar had stood between him and a charging buffalo. "Jimmy and that lion, they're good people." Victoria's laugh held no warmth. "Good people finish last, Thomas. Your grandfather taught me that before the lions killed him." She folded the surveys with manicured fingers that had never known honest work. "Some debts take 40 years to collect." As the sun climbed higher over the Mara, these three Americans, the war hero, the healer, and the predator, moved unknowingly toward a collision that would test the very meaning of loyalty, family, and the price of a human soul. The Monday morning heat was already brutal at 7 a.m. when Jimmy Patterson began his daily walk around the watering hole. Caesar padded beside him, the lion's massive frame casting a shadow that had protected the old Marine for 2 decades. Jimmy's heart medication rattled in his shirt pocket, the same pills he'd been taking for 5 years since his first cardiac episode. "Back in my day, we knew what friendship meant," Jimmy said to Caesar, his weathered hand resting on the lion's mane. "A handshake was a promise. A man's word was his bond." Caesar's amber eyes seemed to understand every syllable, as they had since he was an orphaned cub clinging to life in Jimmy's makeshift nursery. The sound of tires on gravel interrupted their peaceful routine. A black Range Rover approached, its air conditioning humming against the African heat. Victoria Blackwood stepped out, her designer safari outfit pristine despite the dust. At 52, she still carried herself with the predatory confidence that had built her real estate empire, but Jimmy could see the calculation behind her smile. "Jimmy, darling," Victoria called, her voice honey-sweet with false concern. "You look tired. Are you taking your medication properly?" She approached with a small pharmacy bag, ignoring Caesar's low growl. "I brought you a fresh supply from Nairobi. The good stuff. American pharmaceuticals, not that local nonsense." Caesar's growl deepened, his massive body positioning protectively between Victoria and Jimmy. The lion's instincts screamed danger, but Jimmy, ever the gentleman, waved him back. "Easy, son. Victoria's an old friend." The words tasted bitter, memories of their brief romance 40 years ago still carrying the sting of betrayal. "Such a magnificent creature," Victoria said, her eyes never leaving Caesar. "Shame about the new wildlife regulations. They're saying private ownership of big cats will be illegal by next month." She handed Jimmy the medication bag. "These pills are specially formulated for your condition. The doctor insisted you start them immediately." Jimmy accepted the bag, noting how Caesar's agitation increased. The lion began pacing, his usual calm demeanor replaced by obvious distress. "What's wrong with you today, boy?" Jimmy asked. But Caesar's behavior only intensified when Victoria drew closer. "Animals sense things," Victoria said carefully. "Perhaps he knows you're not well. The stress of fighting those development offers can't be good for your heart." She touched Jimmy's arm with feigned affection. "My offer still stands. $50 million for the ranch. You could retire comfortably in Florida. Visit Disney World with your grandchildren." Jimmy's laugh was hollow. "Don't have any grandchildren, Victoria. Don't have any children at all." The admission carried decades of regret. "Caesar here is the closest thing to family I've got." "That's exactly my point," Victoria pressed. "What happens to him when you're gone? At least with my development, we could create a proper wildlife sanctuary. Think of it as your legacy." Caesar suddenly lunged forward, not attacking, but knocking the medication bag from Jimmy's hands. Pills scattered across the red dirt like tiny white stones. Victoria's mask slipped for just a moment, revealing something cold and calculating beneath. "I'm so sorry," she said quickly, kneeling to collect the pills. "How clumsy of me to startle him." But Caesar wasn't finished. He picked up several pills in his mouth and trotted toward the watering hole, spitting them into the muddy water with deliberate precision. "That lion is getting dangerous," Victoria said, standing and brushing dust from her knees. "Maybe it's time to consider relocation." "I know some excellent facilities in South Africa." Jimmy watched Caesar's behavior with growing concern. In 20 years, the lion had never acted so aggressively toward visitors. "He's been with me since he was 6 weeks old," Jimmy said slowly. "Caesar doesn't make mistakes about people." Victoria's smile tightened. "Animals can become unpredictable with age, like humans." She glanced at her expensive watch. "I should go. Thomas is flying in tonight, and I want everything prepared for our meeting with the Land Commission tomorrow." As Victoria's Range Rover disappeared in a cloud of dust, Jimmy knelt beside Caesar, who was still agitated and restless. The lion nudged the scattered pills with his nose, then looked directly into Jimmy's eyes with an intelligence that transcended species. "What are you trying to tell me, son?" Jimmy whispered, picking up one of the scattered tablets. For the first time he noticed the pills looked different, slightly larger, with markings he didn't recognize. His regular medication was blue, these were white. Caesar pressed against Jimmy's side, a massive weight of loyalty and protection. The old Marine's military instincts, dormant for decades, suddenly sparked to life. In 3 wars, he'd learned to trust his gut, and right now, both his gut and his lion were telling him the same thing. Something was very, very wrong. Jimmy Patterson stood in his kitchen that evening, turning the suspicious white pills over in his weathered palm. The bottle Victoria had brought bore his name, but something felt wrong. Caesar lay at his feet, the lion's usual evening calm replaced by restless vigilance. Every few minutes those amber eyes would focus on the medication bottle with unmistakable concern. "You know something, don't you, boy?" Jimmy murmured, kneeling beside his massive companion. Caesar's response was immediate, a low rumble that wasn't quite a growl but carried unmistakable warning. The old Marine's instincts, honed by 3 wars and 40 years of survival, told him to listen. Jimmy walked to his ancient computer and typed, "Digoxin substitutes poisoning," into the search engine. What he found made his blood run cold. Cases of elderly people dying from medication tampering, their deaths attributed to natural heart failure. The perfect crime, virtually undetectable unless someone knew what to look for. His phone rang, startling him from his research. Dr. Maggie Sullivan's voice carried across the crackling connection from Nairobi. "Jimmy, I wanted to check on you. Your blood pressure was elevated at last week's checkup, and I'm concerned about the stress from Victoria's development pressure." "Doc," Jimmy said carefully, "hypothetically speaking, if someone wanted to hurt an old man with a heart condition, how would they do it?" The silence stretched long enough that Jimmy wondered if the connection had failed. Finally, Maggie's voice returned, professional but worried. "Jimmy, that's an odd question. Are you feeling threatened? Is someone pressuring you beyond the normal business negotiations?" Jimmy looked down at Caesar, who was now standing at full alert, ears pricked toward the windows. "Caesar's been acting strange all day. Won't let me take my evening medication. It's like he knows something I don't." "Animals have incredible instincts," Maggie said thoughtfully. "I've seen dogs detect seizures hours before they happen, cats who refuse to leave their owners' sides before medical emergencies. If Caesar is concerned about your medication—" A sound outside made them both freeze. Caesar's head snapped toward the front door, a low snarl building in his throat. Through the window, Jimmy could see headlights approaching, moving slowly up his private road. At this hour, visitors meant trouble. "Someone's coming," Jimmy whispered into the phone. "Doc, if something happens to me, promise me you'll take care of Caesar. He's the only family I've got left." "Jimmy, you're scaring me. Should I call the authorities?" The headlights stopped outside. Jimmy recognized the vehicle, Thomas Blackwood's rental car. Victoria's son stepped out alone, his young face tense with urgency. Caesar's snarl subsided slightly, but the lion remained alert. "It's Victoria's boy," Jimmy said. "I'll call you back." He ended the call and walked to the door, Caesar padding silently beside him. Thomas Blackwood looked nothing like his mother. Where Victoria was all sharp angles and calculated charm, her 28-year-old son carried himself with the awkward honesty of someone still learning to navigate a world built on lies. His environmental science degree had led him into conservation work that directly opposed his mother's development empire. "Mr. Patterson," Thomas said urgently as Jimmy opened the door. "I need to talk to you. It's about my mother and I think you're in danger." Caesar studied the young man carefully, his massive frame blocking the doorway. After a long moment, the lion stepped aside, not welcoming but not hostile either. Jimmy had learned to trust Caesar's judgment about people over the years. "Come in, son," Jimmy said. "You look like you've seen a ghost." Thomas entered the modest living room, his eyes taking in the purple heart on the mantelpiece, the worn furniture that spoke of a life lived simply. "Mr. Patterson, I found something in my mother's files. Geological surveys of your property going back 20 years. Oil reserves, mineral rights. She's been planning this for decades." Jimmy poured 2 glasses of bourbon, his hands steady despite the implications. "I figured it wasn't just about real estate development. 5,000 acres of scrubland doesn't usually attract that kind of attention." "It's worth almost $500 million, Thomas said, accepting the drink with trembling hands. "But that's not the worst part. I found medical records, prescriptions filled under false names, research into heart medications and their complications." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Caesar moved closer to Jimmy, the lion's protective instincts now fully engaged. Jimmy picked up the bottle of pills Victoria had brought that morning, his military training finally clicking all the pieces together. "Your mother's been planning to kill me," Jimmy said matter-of-factly, "and make it look like natural causes." Thomas's face crumpled with shame and horror. I think she may have done this before. My father died of a heart attack 5 years ago. Same symptoms, same type of medication issues. I never questioned it because he was older, had existing health problems." Jimmy's bourbon glass paused halfway to his lips. "She killed your father?" "I can't prove it, but the pattern is identical. Caring friend brings special medication, victim's health deteriorates rapidly, death attributed to natural causes." Thomas pulled out his phone, showing Jimmy dozens of photos of documents. "She's been researching your medical history, your prescriptions, your daily routines. She even has surveillance photos of you and Caesar." The lion in question was now pacing the room, his agitation building as if he could sense the danger closing in around them. Jimmy watched Caesar's behavior with new understanding. The lion hadn't been acting strange. He'd been trying to protect his human from a threat the old Marine's trained instincts had somehow missed. "Why are you telling me this?" Jimmy asked Thomas. "She's your mother." Thomas's laugh was bitter with pain. "Because you saved my life when I was 16. That charging buffalo would have killed me if Caesar hadn't intervened. You and this magnificent animal risked everything to protect a stranger's son. Now I'm returning the favor." Jimmy stood and walked to his gun cabinet, retrieving his old service pistol. The weight felt familiar in his hands, muscle memory from a different life in a different war. "What's your mother's timeline?" "Tomorrow morning," Thomas said urgently. "She's meeting with the Land Commission at noon. She expects you to be indisposed by then. Probably found dead from apparent heart failure, leaving no legal obstacles to her development plans." Caesar's pacing stopped abruptly. The lion's head turned toward the windows, ears straining to catch some sound beyond human hearing. Then Jimmy heard it too, the distant rumble of vehicles approaching, multiple engines moving fast up his private road. "They're coming," Thomas whispered, his face pale with terror. "She must have seen me leave. She knows I warned you." Jimmy checked his weapon, 30 years of combat experience flooding back despite his age. Caesar positioned himself between the humans and the door, 600 pounds of loyalty and lethal protection. Outside, the sound of vehicles grew closer, their headlights now visible through the darkness. The war Jimmy Patterson thought he'd left behind had finally come home. The headlights cut through the African darkness like predatory eyes as 3 black SUVs surrounded Jimmy Patterson's ranch house. Caesar's low growl reverberated through the living room, a sound that seemed to shake the very foundations of the modest home. Jimmy gripped his service pistol, muscle memory from Vietnam flooding back as he assessed defensive positions. "How many men does your mother travel with?" Jimmy asked Thomas, who was peering through the curtains with obvious terror. "Usually 4 security guards plus drivers," Thomas whispered. "Private military contractors. She doesn't take chances when this much money is involved." Through the windows, they could see figures moving in tactical formation, their silhouettes suggesting military training and serious weaponry. Caesar's hackles rose to full alert, his massive frame coiled like a spring. The lion had faced poachers before, but never in defense of his human family's home. Jimmy's phone buzzed with an incoming call. Victoria's name appeared on the screen, her timing impeccable as always. He answered, putting it on speaker so Thomas could hear his mother's true nature. "Jimmy, darling," Victoria's voice carried false sweetness even through the electronic distortion. "I understand my son paid you a visit tonight. I do hope he didn't upset you with any wild stories." "Your boy's got quite an imagination," Jimmy replied calmly, not betraying his position near the window. "We had a nice chat about conservation and family loyalty. Interesting topics, both of them." Caesar suddenly moved to the back door, his behavior indicating movement in that direction. Jimmy realized they were being surrounded, professional style. These weren't simple thugs. Victoria had brought military-grade muscle. "I'm afraid Thomas has been having some emotional difficulties since his father's death," Victoria continued. "Paranoid delusions, conspiracy theories. It's been very difficult for a mother to watch." Thomas's face went white at his mother's casual dismissal of his father's murder. Jimmy placed a steadying hand on the young man's shoulder, recognizing the look of someone whose world had just shattered completely. "Grief affects people differently," Jimmy said into the phone. "Some folks get paranoid, others get murderous. Funny how that works." The silence on the other end stretched long enough that Jimmy wondered if Victoria had hung up. Finally, her voice returned, stripped of all pretense. "You always were too smart for your own good, Jimmy. That's what I loved about you 40 years ago, and what I hate about you now." "So this is about more than money," Jimmy observed, watching Caesar's positioning near the back door. The lion's tactical awareness rivaled any soldier Jimmy had served with. "You rejected me." Victoria's voice turned venomous. "Chose this God-forsaken wilderness over civilization. Over me. Do you have any idea what that did to a young woman's pride?" Jimmy remembered that night decades ago. Victoria demanding he return to America with her, build an empire together. He'd chosen the simple life, conservation work, and the quiet satisfaction of protecting rather than exploiting. "So you spent 40 years planning revenge?" "I spent 40 years building the resources to take what should have been mine," she corrected. "Your land, your minerals, your stubborn independence, all of it." Through the front window, Jimmy could see armed figures taking positions behind vehicles. Caesar's growl intensified, and the lion began moving between rooms with purposeful intelligence, as if conducting his own tactical assessment. "The medication switch was elegant," Jimmy admitted. "Replace my heart pills with a stronger compound. Let my existing condition do the work. Natural causes, no investigation, clear title to the property." "Thomas ruined that," Victoria snarled. "My own son betraying me for a washed-up old soldier and his pet." Thomas finally found his voice, speaking toward the phone with years of suppressed rage. "You killed Dad, your own husband, for money." "Your father was weak," Victoria replied coldly. "He would have given everything away to environmental charities. I built our fortune. I decided how it should be used." Caesar suddenly bolted toward the front door, his massive body slamming against it with enough force to rattle the hinges. Outside, Jimmy could hear shouting and the sound of men scrambling for new positions. The lion's charge had disrupted their approach, buying precious time. "Call Dr. Sullivan," Jimmy ordered Thomas, tossing him a second phone. Tell her to contact the authorities and stay away. This isn't her fight." But even as Thomas dialed, Jimmy knew help was 20 miles away over rough roads. They were on their own with whatever Victoria's mercenaries had planned. The first gunshot shattered the living room window, embedding itself in the wall where Jimmy had been standing moments before. Caesar roared with fury, a sound that echoed across the Mara like thunder. More shots followed, systematically targeting the house's windows and lighting. "She's not trying to kill us," Jimmy realized aloud. "She wants it to look like a robbery gone wrong. Multiple casualties, house ransacked, tragic but believable." Thomas was shouting into the phone at Dr. Sullivan, trying to explain their situation over the noise of gunfire. Through his conversation, Jimmy caught fragments. "Armed men, mother trying to kill, need police immediately." Caesar had positioned himself by the back door, his behavior indicating movement in that direction. Jimmy made a tactical decision that went against every survival instinct but honored something deeper than self-preservation. "Thomas," he said quietly, "when I open that front door, Caesar and I are going out first. You slip out the back and run for the rocks behind the house. Keep running until you reach the main road." "I'm not leaving you," Thomas protested, surprising himself with his own courage. "You're the only witness to your mother's crimes," Jimmy replied grimly. "If we all die here, she wins everything. Your testimony is the only thing that can stop her." Another volley of gunshots peppered the house, more systematic now. Victoria's men were professional enough to maintain steady pressure while avoiding anything that might look like overkill to future investigators. Jimmy's phone rang again. Victoria's voice was businesslike now, all pretense abandoned. "You have 5 minutes to surrender, Jimmy. Walk out with your hands visible and Thomas won't be harmed. Continue this resistance and I'll make sure the lions find very little left to scavenge." "Counteroffer," Jimmy said calmly. "You and your hired guns clear out now, and I won't let Caesar loose on you. Ever seen what 600 pounds of protective fury can do to human beings?" Victoria's laugh was genuinely amused. "You're threatening me with a circus animal? Jimmy, darling, my men have elephant guns. Your pet lion is just another target." But Caesar wasn't just another target, and Jimmy knew it. For 20 years, the lion had lived free in some of Africa's most dangerous territory. He'd faced down hyena packs, territorial elephants, and armed poachers. More importantly, he was fighting to protect his family. "Caesar's not a pet," Jimmy said into the phone. "He's a partner, and partners watch each other's backs." He hung up and looked at Thomas, seeing the young man's father in his determined expression. "You sure you want to do this? Last chance to run." Thomas checked the pistol Jimmy had given him, his hands steadier than his voice. "That woman killed my father and tried to kill you. She's not my mother anymore." Outside, the gunfire had stopped. Victoria's men were repositioning for a final assault, probably planning to storm the house from multiple directions. Jimmy counted at least 8 muzzle flashes from different positions. Serious firepower for what was supposed to look like a robbery. Caesar moved to the front door and looked back at Jimmy with an expression that needed no translation. The lion was ready to fight, ready to die if necessary, but absolutely unwilling to surrender his family to these invaders. Jimmy placed his hand on Caesar's massive head, feeling the vibration of suppressed power beneath his palm. "Just like old times, son. You and me against the world." The front door exploded inward under the impact of a battering ram. Caesar launched himself through the opening with a roar that seemed to shake the very earth, his golden form disappearing into the darkness beyond. Shouts of terror and confusion erupted from Victoria's assault team as they encountered something far beyond their tactical planning. Jimmy followed his lion into the night, his old soldier's heart pounding with the familiar rhythm of combat. Behind him, Thomas slipped out the back door and ran for the rocks, carrying with him the testimony that might yet bring justice to a woman who had turned love into murder. The battle for Sunset Ridge had begun, and Jimmy Patterson was no longer fighting alone. Caesar's roar shattered the night as 600 pounds of fury collided with Victoria's assault team. The lead mercenary's scream cut through the darkness, followed by the metallic clatter of weapons hitting the ground. Jimmy emerged from his house to chaos, trained soldiers scattering like startled prey before an apex predator whose only mission was protecting his family. "Jesus Christ, what is that thing?" one of the mercenaries shouted, his tactical training useless against an opponent that moved like liquid death through the African night. Jimmy took cover behind his truck, his service pistol steady in hands that remembered Vietnam. Caesar had vanished into the darkness, but the sounds of his presence were unmistakable. The heavy impact of a massive body, the distinctive crack of bones breaking, and the kind of screaming that would haunt these men's nightmares forever. Victoria's voice crackled through her men's radio communications, her composure finally cracking. "What's your status? Report!" "Ma'am, we're taking casualties," came the panicked response. "This isn't just a lion. It's like it knows military tactics. It's using cover, flanking maneuvers. How is that possible?" Jimmy smiled grimly in the darkness. 20 years of living with Caesar had taught him that intelligence wasn't limited to humans. The lion had observed countless interactions, learned from watching Jimmy's old war stories acted out during their evening walks. Caesar understood strategy because he'd been educated by a master tactician. A muzzle flash erupted from behind the water tank, followed immediately by Caesar's distinctive hunting growl. The mercenary's weapon went silent, and Jimmy heard the unmistakable sound of a body hitting the ground hard. That was 3 down in less than 5 minutes. "Fall back to the vehicles," Victoria's voice commanded through the radio. "Regroup and establish a perimeter." But Caesar wasn't giving them time to regroup. The lion moved through the darkness like a golden ghost, striking with surgical precision and vanishing before return fire could find him. Jimmy recognized the hunting pattern. Caesar was herding the remaining mercenaries into a kill zone, using the terrain and his intimate knowledge of the ranch's layout. From his position behind the truck, Jimmy could see Thomas making his way toward the rocky outcrop behind the house. The young man moved carefully, using shadows and natural cover with surprising skill. His environmental fieldwork had apparently included some practical survival training. A mercenary broke from cover near the barn, running desperately toward the vehicles. Caesar materialized from the shadows like vengeance itself, covering 30 yards in seconds. The man's screams echoed across the Mara before cutting off abruptly. Jimmy didn't need to see the details to know that Victoria's hired guns were learning the difference between hunting humans and facing Africa's true king. "Status report." Victoria's voice was shrill now, panic replacing her earlier confidence. "We need immediate backup." The surviving team leader gasped into his radio. "This animal is systematically hunting us. It's like fighting a ghost that weighs 600 pounds. Jimmy keyed his own radio, having monitored their frequency for the past 10 minutes. "Victoria, this is Jimmy. Still want to negotiate?" The silence stretched long enough that Jimmy wondered if she'd switched channels. Finally, her voice returned, cold with rage. "You turned that monster into a weapon." "Caesar's not a monster," Jimmy replied calmly, watching another mercenary attempt to reach the vehicles only to be cut off by a flash of golden fur. "He's family, and family protects family." "That's something you never understood." Through the darkness, Jimmy could hear Caesar's tactical movements, the soft pad of massive paws on earth, the almost silent rustle of grass, the occasional low growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. The lion was using psychological warfare now, letting the remaining mercenaries know he was close without revealing his exact position. "How many men do you have left, Victoria?" Jimmy asked into the radio. "Because Caesar's just getting started." A burst of automatic fire erupted from near the main road, followed immediately by Caesar's roar of fury. But this roar was different. Pain mixed with rage. Jimmy's heart clenched as he realized one of the mercenaries had finally managed to wound his partner. "Got him!" someone shouted triumphantly. "The beast is hit!" Jimmy's calm evaporated instantly. Caesar wasn't just his companion, he was the closest thing to a son Jimmy had ever known. The old Marine's protective instincts, dormant for decades, exploded into deadly focus. He moved from cover with tactical precision, his service pistol speaking with the authority of a man who'd survived 3 wars. The mercenary who'd shot Caesar never saw Jimmy coming. One moment he was celebrating his successful shot. The next he was staring down the barrel of a .45 held by a grandfather whose eyes promised death. "Where is he hit?" Jimmy demanded, pressing the gun against the man's forehead. "Shoulder," the mercenary gasped. "Just a graze, but enough to slow him down." In the distance, Caesar's roar sounded again, weakened but still defiant. Jimmy could hear the lion moving more slowly now, his tactical advantage compromised by injury. The remaining mercenaries would regroup quickly, realizing their supernatural opponent was mortal after all. "Jimmy!" Thomas's voice called from the rocks. "Dr. Sullivan is on her way with the police." 20 minutes out! 20 minutes might as well be 20 hours. Victoria's remaining men were already repositioning, their confidence returning now that Caesar was wounded. Jimmy made a tactical decision that went against every survival instinct but honored something deeper than self-preservation. He broke from cover and ran toward Caesar's last known position, trusting 20 years of partnership to guide him through the darkness. Behind him, automatic weapons fire erupted as the mercenaries realized their primary target was exposed. Jimmy found Caesar lying behind the water tank, his golden coat dark with blood where a bullet had torn through his left shoulder. The lion's eyes were alert but pained, his massive frame trembling with the effort of staying upright. "Easy, son," Jimmy whispered, dropping to his knees beside his wounded partner. "We're getting out of this together, just like always." Caesar struggled to stand, his loyalty overriding his injury. The lion managed to rise, but Jimmy could see the wound was serious enough to compromise his mobility. They were both vulnerable now, surrounded by professional killers with no cover and nowhere to run. "Touching," Victoria's voice came from the darkness as she emerged from behind one of the SUVs. She held a rifle with comfortable familiarity, flanked by her 2 remaining mercenaries. The old soldier and his faithful pet, dying together in the African dust. Almost poetic. Jimmy kept one hand on Caesar's mane, feeling the lion's muscles coil despite his injury. Even wounded, Caesar was still dangerous to anyone foolish enough to come within striking distance. "You won't get away with this," Jimmy said calmly. "Thomas reached the police. Your own son will testify against you." Victoria's laugh was genuinely amused. "Thomas will inherit everything when I'm done here. Children are remarkably forgiving when there's enough money involved. He'll come to understand that sometimes ugly choices are necessary for beautiful outcomes." "You don't know your son at all," Jimmy replied. "He's got more integrity in his little finger than you've had in your entire life." One of the mercenaries shifted position, trying to get a clear shot around Caesar's protective bulk. The lion sensed the movement and turned his massive head, amber eyes promising death despite his injury. Even wounded, Caesar's presence was enough to make trained killers hesitate. "Finish them," Victoria ordered coldly. "Make it look like they fought back. Self-defense during a robbery gone wrong." The mercenaries raised their weapons, professional executioners preparing to end 20 years of partnership between an old soldier and his lion. Jimmy closed his eyes, one hand still resting on Caesar's mane, ready to die beside the only family he'd ever truly known. The sound of approaching helicopters cut through the night like salvation itself. The helicopter's searchlights cut through the darkness like divine intervention, but they arrived 30 seconds too late. Victoria's finger was already tightening on the trigger when the first bullet found its mark. Jimmy Patterson gasped as the round tore through his chest, his hands slipping from Caesar's mane as he collapsed onto the red African earth. Caesar's roar of anguish shattered the night, a sound that seemed to contain every moment of their 20-year bond. The wounded lion struggled to his feet, positioning his massive body between Jimmy and Victoria's smoking rifle. Blood flowed from both the lion's shoulder wound and Jimmy's chest, mixing in the dust like a crimson covenant of loyalty that death itself couldn't break. "Jimmy!" Dr. Maggie Sullivan's voice carried across the chaos as she leaped from the lead helicopter before it fully touched down. The searchlights revealed the scene in stark detail. Victoria standing over her victims with smoking weapon, Caesar's protective stance despite his own wounds, and Jimmy's life ebbing away in the dirt of the land he'd spent 40 years protecting. The Kenyan police poured from the helicopters with weapons drawn, but Victoria's mercenaries had already begun their retreat into the darkness. Professional soldiers knew when a mission had failed, and the arrival of official backup meant their employer's protection was worthless. "Drop your weapon!" the police commander shouted in English, his rifle trained on Victoria. But the wealthy American seemed lost in a moment of triumph, her eyes fixed on Jimmy's still form with satisfaction that transcended mere business success. 40 years, she whispered, loud enough for the approaching officers to hear. 40 years I waited for this moment. He chose this God-forsaken wilderness over civilization, over me. Now he can die in it. Caesar struggled toward Jimmy's body, his wounded shoulder making each step an agony of determination. The lion collapsed beside his human partner, pressing his massive head against Jimmy's chest, as if willing him back to life through sheer force of love. Dr. Sullivan reached them first, her medical training overriding her emotional shock. Jimmy's pulse was weak, but present, his breathing shallow but steady. "He's alive!" she called to the medical team emerging from the second helicopter. "Chest wound, possible lung involvement, but he's alive." Thomas appeared from the rocks, his face streaked with tears and dust. He looked at his mother being handcuffed by Kenyan police, then at the man who'd risked everything to expose her crimes. "Is he going to make it?" "I don't know," Maggie admitted, working frantically to stabilize Jimmy's condition. "The bullet missed his heart, but there's significant blood loss. We need to get him to Nairobi immediately." Caesar whimpered, a sound no one had ever heard from the mighty lion. His amber eyes, usually so confident and alert, now held the desperation of someone watching their world collapse. The lion understood death. He'd seen it countless times in the wild, but understanding didn't make acceptance any easier. As the medical team prepared Jimmy for transport, Caesar struggled to follow. His wounded shoulder made movement difficult, but loyalty demanded he stay close to his dying partner. Dr. Sullivan found herself faced with an impossible choice. Treat the human or comfort the animal whose grief was almost too painful to witness. "Easy, Caesar," she whispered, approaching the lion with careful respect. "We're going to help him, but I need you to let us work." Caesar's response was a low whine that somehow conveyed both understanding and heartbreak. The lion allowed the medical team to work, but his eyes never left Jimmy's face. 20 years of partnership had taught Caesar to read every expression, every breath, every sign of life or death in his human companion. Victoria's voice cut through the medical activity with cold satisfaction. "You're wasting your time, doctor. At his age, with that kind of wound, he won't survive the flight to Nairobi. Some battles are meant to be lost." Thomas turned on his mother with fury that surprised everyone present. "Shut up," he snarled, his gentle nature finally breaking under the weight of her cruelty. "You've done enough damage for one lifetime." The medical team managed to stabilize Jimmy enough for transport, but his condition remained critical. As they lifted him toward the helicopter, Caesar tried to follow, his determination overriding his physical limitations. The sight of the wounded lion struggling to accompany his dying partner brought tears to hardened police officers who'd thought they'd seen everything. "He can't fly in his condition," the helicopter pilot said practically. "The lion's too wounded, too heavy, and too unstable for medical transport." Caesar seemed to understand the words, or perhaps he simply recognized the finality in the humans' voices. The lion stopped trying to reach the helicopter and instead positioned himself where he could watch Jimmy being loaded for transport. His massive frame trembled with the effort of staying upright, but his vigil never wavered. Dr. Sullivan made a decision that went against every medical protocol, but honored something deeper than professional duty. "I'm staying with Caesar," she announced. "Jimmy would want someone here with him." "Doctor, you're needed in surgery," the medical team leader protested. "His chances are already minimal. He needs every advantage." "Caesar is part of Jimmy's family," Maggie replied firmly. "Family doesn't abandon family." "There are other surgeons in Nairobi, but there's only one person here who understands what this lion means to Jimmy Patterson." As the helicopter lifted off into the night, carrying Jimmy toward uncertain survival, Caesar collapsed completely. The lion's physical wounds were serious, but not fatal. It was his emotional trauma that threatened to kill him. Dr. Sullivan had seen animals die of grief before, their will to live simply evaporating when their bonds were broken. Victoria watched the scene with something that might have been regret flickering in her eyes. "I never meant for it to come to this," she said quietly to Thomas as the police prepared to transport her to custody. "I just wanted what should have been mine." "Dad should have been yours too," Thomas replied bitterly. "But that wasn't enough either, was it? Nothing would ever be enough for you." The police commander approached Dr. Sullivan as she knelt beside Caesar's prone form. "What do you want us to do with the lion? In his condition, he might not survive transport to a proper facility." Maggie looked down at Caesar, seeing in his amber eyes the same devastation she'd felt when her own world had collapsed years ago. The lion's breathing was labored, his massive frame somehow diminished by grief that seemed to drain his very life force. "We stay here," she decided. "Caesar belongs on this land with Jimmy's memory. If he's going to die, let it be in the place he shared with the only family he ever knew." Through the long African night, Dr. Sullivan maintained her vigil beside the grieving lion. Caesar's condition deteriorated steadily, not from his physical wounds, but from a broken heart that veterinary medicine couldn't heal. The lion's eyes remained fixed on the horizon where the helicopter had disappeared, as if sheer will could bring Jimmy back. As dawn approached, painting the Mara sky in shades of gold that matched Caesar's fading coat, Dr. Sullivan's phone rang with news from Nairobi. Jimmy Patterson was in surgery, his condition critical but stable. The bullet had missed vital organs, and his old soldier's constitution was proving stronger than expected. "Did you hear that, Caesar?" Maggie whispered to the lion. "Jimmy's fighting. He's not giving up, and neither should you." Caesar's only response was a barely audible whimper, the sound of hope dying in the African dawn. The lion, who had faced down elephants and survived 20 years of wilderness dangers, was being defeated by something no amount of courage could overcome: the unbearable possibility of losing the human who had given his life meaning. The sun rose over Sunset Ridge, illuminating a scene of loyalty that transcended species, and a love so profound that death itself seemed like a small obstacle compared to the bond between an old soldier and his lion. 3 days passed like an eternity. Caesar hadn't moved from the spot where Jimmy's blood had soaked into the African earth, his massive frame growing weaker with each hour that brought no news of his partner's survival. Dr. Sullivan maintained her vigil beside the grieving lion, administering IV fluids and pain medication, but she knew that medical intervention could only do so much against a broken heart. The international media had descended on Sunset Ridge like vultures, drawn by the story of the lion who wouldn't leave his dying master's side. Satellite trucks lined the dusty road, and reporters from CNN, BBC, and National Geographic competed for the most dramatic angle on a story that seemed to capture the world's imagination. Hatch Caesar. The lion was trending globally, but Caesar remained oblivious to his fame, his amber eyes fixed on the horizon where the medical helicopter had disappeared. On the morning of the fourth day, Dr. Sullivan's phone rang with the call she'd been dreading. The voice from Nairobi General Hospital was professionally gentle, the tone that medical professionals reserved for delivering the worst possible news. "Dr. Sullivan, this is Dr. Kamau from trauma surgery. I'm afraid I have to inform you that Mr. Patterson took a turn for the worse during the night. We've done everything possible, but his age and the severity of his injuries." The voice trailed off, letting silence carry the weight of finality. Maggie's hand trembled as she gripped the phone. Beside her, Caesar seemed to sense the nature of the call, his massive head lifting slightly for the first time in days. The lion's eyes, clouded with grief and exhaustion, focused on her face with desperate hope. "I'm sorry," Dr. Kamau continued. "He passed peacefully at 3:47 this morning. His last words were about someone named Caesar. He kept saying, 'Take care of my boy.'" The phone slipped from Maggie's numb fingers, clattering onto the red dirt beside Caesar's prone form. The lion's eyes searched her face, reading the devastation there with the intuitive understanding that had defined his relationship with Jimmy for 20 years. Caesar's massive frame shuddered once, then went completely still. The assembled media crew captured the moment when Caesar finally understood that Jimmy was never coming home. The lion's roar of anguish echoed across the Mara, a sound so primal and devastating that hardened war correspondents found themselves wiping away tears. It was the voice of absolute loss, the cry of a soul being torn in half. Caesar struggled to his feet, his wounded shoulder forgotten in the face of grief that transcended physical pain. The lion began to pace in a tight circle around the blood-stained earth where Jimmy had fallen, his movements becoming increasingly frantic as the reality of permanent separation sank in. "Easy, boy," Dr. Sullivan whispered, approaching Caesar with the careful respect she'd learned from watching Jimmy. I know it hurts." But Caesar was beyond comfort. The lion who had faced down charging elephants and survived countless dangers was being destroyed by something far more devastating than any physical threat. His partner, his family, his entire reason for existence was gone, and Caesar's magnificent spirit was crumbling under the weight of that loss. Thomas Blackwood arrived that afternoon, having driven straight from Nairobi after posting bail for his mother. Victoria remained in custody, facing charges of attempted murder and conspiracy, but her son carried a burden heavier than any legal consequences. He found Dr. Sullivan sitting beside Caesar's motionless form, both of them keeping vigil over a grief too profound for words. "How is he?" Thomas asked, though Caesar's condition was obvious to anyone with eyes. The lion had stopped eating entirely, refused all medical intervention, and seemed to be simply waiting to join Jimmy in whatever realm awaited beyond death. "Animals can die of grief," Maggie explained quietly. "I've seen it before with bonded pairs. When one dies, the other sometimes just gives up. Caesar's heart is literally breaking." Thomas knelt beside the lion, his own guilt over his mother's crimes making him desperate to offer some form of comfort. "Caesar, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry about what she did. Jimmy was a good man, and he loved you more than anything in this world." Caesar's only response was a barely audible whimper, the sound of hope dying in real time. The lion's breathing had become labored, his magnificent golden coat dulled by grief and dehydration. Doctor. Sullivan's medical training told her that Caesar had perhaps hours left, maybe less. As the sun began to set over the Mara, painting the sky in the same golden hues that had always reminded Jimmy of Caesar's coat, Dr. Sullivan made a decision that went against every professional instinct but honored something deeper than veterinary protocol. "I'm going to tell him," she announced to Thomas. "Jimmy left something for Caesar, a video message he recorded last year during his heart surgery. He made me promise to show it to Caesar if anything ever happened to him." Thomas looked skeptical. "You think Caesar will understand a video?" "Caesar understood Jimmy better than most humans understand each other," Maggie replied, setting up her laptop near the lion's massive head. "They had their own language, their own way of communicating. Maybe Jimmy's voice will reach him where nothing else can." The laptop screen flickered to life, showing Jimmy Patterson sitting in his modest living room, Caesar visible in the background. The recording was dated 8 months earlier during Jimmy's recovery from his previous heart episode. His voice was weaker than usual but filled with the same gentle authority that had guided Caesar for 20 years. "Hey there, son," Jimmy's recorded voice began, and Caesar's ears immediately pricked up at the familiar sound. "If you're watching this, it means I'm not there with you anymore, and I need you to listen to what I have to say." Caesar raised his massive head, staring at the screen with confusion and desperate hope. The lion's eyes searched for Jimmy's physical presence, but his ears remained focused on the voice that had been his anchor for 2 decades. "I know you're hurting right now," Jimmy continued from the recording. "I know you want to give up, want to come find me wherever I've gone, but I need you to stay, Caesar. I need you to live." The lion moved closer to the laptop, his massive frame trembling with the effort of standing. For the first time in days, Caesar showed interest in something other than his own grief. "You taught me what loyalty means," Jimmy's voice continued, his eyes bright with unshed tears even in the recording. "You showed me that love doesn't end just because someone goes away. But love isn't about dying together, son. It's about living for each other." Caesar's whimper was heartbreaking, the sound of recognition mixed with unbearable loss. The lion gently touched the laptop screen with his nose, trying to reach through the barrier between past and present. "There's someone coming who's going to need you," Jimmy said in the recording, his voice taking on prophetic certainty. "Someone who's been searching for family just as long as you have. Take care of her, Caesar. Protect her like you protected me. That's how you honor our friendship, by giving someone else the same love you gave me." As if summoned by Jimmy's words, a figure emerged from the gathering darkness. An elderly woman moved slowly up the dusty road, her steps deliberate despite obvious exhaustion. She was African, her weathered face marked by decades of hard living, but her eyes held the same fierce intelligence that had characterized Jimmy Patterson. "Who is that?" Thomas whispered. But Dr. Sullivan was already rising to her feet, recognition dawning in her expression. The woman approached their small group with quiet dignity, her gaze moving between Caesar and the laptop screen, where Jimmy's voice continued to speak. When she was close enough for the firelight to illuminate her features clearly, she spoke in accented English. "My name is Amara Patterson," she said simply. "Jimmy was my husband. I've come to take my family home." The silence that followed was broken only by Caesar's sharp intake of breath and Jimmy's voice from the recording. "Caesar, I'd like you to meet someone very important, someone I should have told you about years ago." The revelation hit Dr. Sullivan like a physical blow. Jimmy Patterson hadn't been alone all these years. He'd had a wife, an African woman whose existence he'd kept secret for reasons that probably involved protection, legal complications, or simply the complex realities of interracial marriage in remote Kenya. Caesar stared at Amara with obvious confusion. but something in her scent, her manner, or perhaps some quality that reminded him of Jimmy, seemed to penetrate his grief. The lion took a tentative step toward this stranger who claimed to be family. "He told me about you," Amara continued, addressing Caesar directly. "Every letter, every phone call, he spoke of his brave lion who saved his life more times than he could count. And he said you were the son he never had, the family that kept him whole." Caesar's response was immediate and devastating. The lion collapsed at Amara's feet, his massive frame shaking with sobs that seemed to come from the depths of his soul. For the first time since Jimmy's shooting, Caesar's grief found expression in something other than silent suffering. Amara knelt beside the lion without fear, her weathered hands gentle as she stroked Caesar's mane. "I know, my brave boy, I know how much you loved him, but he's not really gone, you see. He's in here." She touched Caesar's massive chest. "And here," she touched his head. "And he lives on through the love you gave him." The world seemed to hold its breath as these two beings, the grieving lion and the hidden wife, found solace in their shared loss. Caesar's breathing began to steady for the first time in days, and Dr. Sullivan realized they were witnessing something miraculous, the beginning of healing for a heart that had seemed beyond repair. Jimmy's recorded voice provided the final truth. "Caesar, take care of Amara. She's been my secret blessing for 40 years, and now she's yours. Together, you can keep our family alive." 6 months later, the morning sun painted Sunset Ridge in shades of gold that seemed to celebrate life rather than mourn death. The James Patterson Wildlife Sanctuary stretched across 10,000 acres of pristine Kenyan wilderness, its boundaries marked not by fences, but by the understanding that this land belonged to something greater than human ambition. Caesar emerged from the shade of the great acacia tree where Jimmy's memorial stone stood, his magnificent frame restored to full health and vitality. The bullet wound in his shoulder had healed completely, leaving only a thin scar hidden beneath his golden mane, a reminder of the night when loyalty had been tested by gunfire and emerged victorious. Amara Patterson sat on the porch of the expanded ranch house watching Caesar lead a group of rescued lion cubs through their morning exercises. At 72, Jimmy's widow had become the sanctuary's heart and soul, her gentle wisdom bridging the gap between human ambition and animal needs. The cubs followed Caesar with the devoted attention of students learning from a master, and Caesar's patience with them reflected the same nurturing spirit Jimmy had shown him decades earlier. "Good morning, my brave boy," Amara called to Caesar, and the great lion padded over to receive his customary morning greeting, a gentle touch on his massive head and a few words spoken in the Maasai dialect that Caesar had learned to understand. Jimmy had taught Caesar English. Amara was teaching him to be African again. Dr. Margaret Sullivan emerged from the veterinary clinic, wiping her hands on a towel after completing morning rounds. The past 6 months had transformed her as much as they had healed Caesar. Jimmy's secret will had revealed the most shocking truth of all. Dr. Sullivan wasn't just a colleague who had cared for Caesar. She was Jimmy's daughter, born to a young woman in Boston 30 years earlier and given up for adoption when Jimmy's military career made fatherhood impossible. "How are our patients today?" Amara asked as Maggie joined them on the porch. The older woman had welcomed her stepdaughter with the grace of someone who understood that families come in many forms, and love doesn't diminish when it's shared. "The zebra foal is responding well to treatment, and the elephant calf finally took formula from a bottle," Maggie reported, settling into the chair beside Amara. "Caesar helped with both cases. I think the animals trust medical procedures more when he's present." Caesar had indeed become the sanctuary's unofficial therapy animal, his calm presence soothing frightened creatures during treatment. His intelligence seemed to have expanded in the months since Jimmy's death, as if taking on greater responsibilities had unlocked capabilities that simple companionship hadn't required. Thomas Blackwood's voice carried across the yard as he approached with a group of visiting school children from Nairobi. At 28, Victoria's son had found redemption through dedicating his life to the sanctuary's mission. His environmental science background made him an ideal educator, and his personal story of choosing justice over family loyalty had become central to the sanctuary's anti-poaching message. "And this is Caesar," Thomas was explaining to the wide-eyed children. "He's the bravest lion in all of Africa, and he teaches us that love is stronger than anything, stronger than fear, stronger than danger, stronger even than death itself." Caesar approached the group with dignified patience, allowing the children to observe him from a respectful distance. His behavior around young humans was remarkable, protective but gentle, aware of their vulnerability while recognizing their innate goodness. Several of the children held up drawings they'd made of Caesar, and the lions studied each one with apparent approval. "Mr. Thomas," one little girl asked in careful English, "is it true that Caesar came to Mr. Jimmy's funeral and wouldn't let anyone touch the coffin?" Thomas smiled, glancing toward the memorial stone where fresh flowers appeared daily. No one knew who brought them, but everyone suspected Caesar had learned to select and arrange them himself. "It's true," Thomas confirmed. "Caesar loved Mr. Jimmy so much that he wanted to make sure nothing bad could happen to him, even after he died." "Like a guardian angel," another child whispered, and Caesar's ears pricked up at the reverent tone. The lion had become something of a legend among local communities, with stories of his loyalty spreading far beyond the sanctuary's boundaries. The sound of approaching vehicles interrupted the peaceful morning. A convoy of SUVs marked with government insignia was making its way up the dusty road, followed by news vans from international media outlets. Today marked the official opening of the sanctuary's new conservation research facility, funded by Jimmy's substantial inheritance and matching grants from organizations around the world. Bobby Chen emerged from the lead vehicle, his camera equipment already capturing Caesar's majestic form against the backdrop of the African wilderness. The photographer's documentary about Caesar and Jimmy's friendship had won 3 Emmy Awards and generated millions of dollars in conservation funding. More importantly, it had changed public perception about the intelligence and emotional depth of wild animals. "Caesar!" Bobby called, and the lion's response was immediate recognition. Over the months, Bobby had become part of the extended family, his gentle presence and respectful photography earning Caesar's trust. The lion approached the photographer with obvious pleasure, allowing Bobby to capture intimate moments that continued to amaze audiences worldwide. Victoria Blackwood was notably absent from the celebration. She remained in a Kenyan prison serving 25 years for attempted murder and conspiracy. Her vast fortune had been liquidated to pay restitution and fund conservation efforts, an ironic conclusion to her decades-long pursuit of wealth. Thomas visited her monthly, still hoping for reconciliation, but Victoria's pride remained unbroken even in defeat. As the official ceremony began, Caesar positioned himself near Jimmy's memorial stone, his presence lending dignity to the proceedings. Government officials and international conservationists spoke about the sanctuary's mission, but the real message was communicated by Caesar himself, that the bonds between humans and animals could transcend species, creating families that were stronger than blood and more enduring than death. Maggie stepped to the podium as the ceremony's final speaker, her voice carrying clearly across the assembled crowd. "My father, Jimmy Patterson, believed that home isn't a place, it's the people who love you unconditionally. Caesar taught him that family isn't limited by species, and together they taught all of us that loyalty is the foundation of civilization itself." Caesar's roar of approval echoed across the Mara, a sound that seemed to carry Jimmy's voice in its depths. The great lion had found his purpose in preserving his partner's legacy, proving that love doesn't end with death, it transforms into something even more powerful. As the sun reached its zenith over the sanctuary, Caesar led his cubs back toward the shade of the memorial tree. 3 generations of rescue animals followed in his wake. Lions, elephants, zebras, and dozens of other species that had found safety under his protection. Amara watched from the porch, her weathered hands clasped together in satisfaction. "Jimmy would be proud," she murmured to Maggie. His boy became everything he hoped, a protector, a teacher, a bridge between worlds. Caesar paused at the memorial stone, touching it gently with his massive paw in a daily ritual that had never ceased. Then he settled into the shade, his amber eyes scanning the horizon with the vigilance of a king protecting his kingdom. The James Patterson Wildlife Sanctuary thrived under Caesar's watchful presence, proving that some bonds are indeed eternal and that love, once given truly, creates legacies that outlast any individual life. In a world where loyalty seems extinct and genuine connection feels impossible to find, Caesar's story reminds us that the most profound relationships often come when we least expect them. Jimmy Patterson thought he was rescuing a wounded lion cub, but what he really found was the son he never knew he needed. Their 20-year bond proves that family isn't always about blood. Sometimes it's about showing up, day after day, with unwavering devotion. Caesar's grief at Jimmy's funeral moved millions because it reflected our own deepest fears. Will anyone remember us? Will anyone miss us when we're gone? But more importantly, it showed us the answer. Yes, if we love courageously and completely. The sanctuary they built together now shelters hundreds of rescued animals, creating ripple effects of compassion that will continue for generations. Caesar's loyalty didn't end with Jimmy's death. It transformed into something even more powerful, a living legacy of love. Every morning, Caesar still visits Jimmy's memorial stone, proving that some connections transcend even death itself. In our disposable culture, Caesar reminds us that true bonds are eternal and that it's never too late to find or become someone's forever family. What relationship in your life has surprised you with its depth and meaning? Have you ever experienced a connection that transcended what you thought was possible? Share your story in the comments below. We'd love to hear about the unexpected bonds that have shaped your life.